Hello, everybody. This is Gregory with 5 Minute Catholic Apologetics and Living. Today, I wanted to do a live stream. It's been some time since I've done a live stream. I think it's probably been several months since I've done one. I went through a phase of maybe 5 or 6 people that I interviewed. It's probably been 5 or 6 months since I have done a live stream with other people, with just regular Catholics. I think the majority of them were regular Catholics. I did do a live stream with a religious hippie who is a young Catholic girl who has a YouTube channel. But aside from that, most of my live streams are just with regular old Catholics. And so I felt like doing a live stream for about 30 minutes just on Catholic Q&A. If anyone wants to call in, let me see if I got the phone number here. So if you want to call in and ask a question about Catholicism, okay, if nobody shows up, I'm more than possible just to talk to myself about stuff. But it'd be great if there's anybody here who wants to either post something in the comments or to call in, again, with all things having to do with religion, because religion is something that is, I guess you could say, is hot and sensitive. If you have any questions about Catholicism, say them in charity, ask them in charity. There's going to be no trolling or insulting things about the faith. Just ask a question or we'll go from there. But anybody who is maligning the faith, you're going to be blocked from the live stream. So it's possible to have conversations about things that are heated without having to resort to name calling and casting aspersions and so forth. So please call in or put in a chat. I do have an Instagram called Catholic or Protestant. Now, I have not been able to access it for about 2 months. For about 5 months, I was posting a daily picture of a church, and you had to guess if it was Catholic or if it was something that was not Catholic, like Anglican or Protestant or so forth, Orthodox. And I loved doing that channel, but unfortunately, my phone I'm not able to receive text identifications. You only have to punch in the code. So I haven't been able to get on Instagram for that. So, but you can go to that Instagram. It's definitely there, and you can look at it. There's probably about 60 churches that are mentioned over there that you can guess if they're Protestant or Catholic. Newsflash, please don't look at the chat, because the comments in Instagram, I normally within 24 hours would reveal the answer to that. So let's talk about Catholicism. So we can talk about some misconceptions of the Catholic Church or some inerrancies that people have about the Catholic Church. I think the large majority of people who are not Catholic who have negative impressions of the Catholic Church, I think it stems from a couple of things. I think the large majority of non-Catholics are well-intentioned, good people. And I think that many times they're just either raised to not like the church, either by their family or by their pastor or pastors, or maybe it is something that they were explained to at school, whether it be at high school or college. But there are a lot of misconceptions about the Catholic Church, and I don't necessarily expect Protestants to look these things up on their own, because if you're a practicing Christian of whatever denomination, there's really no reason to necessarily look up the Catholic Church. For example, if you're a Presbyterian, it's not like you're Googling what's the principal tenets of Methodism or the principal tenets of Pentecostalism. So why would they look up Catholicism? Well, I think that all Protestants, regardless if they have a prejudice or a bias, and I would say most Protestants do, just from my encounter, and I don't mean that in a negative way that they do, I mean that you rarely ever find Protestants who will be open to you about what they think the Catholic Church teaches. And Fulton was a great evangelist of the Catholic faith back in the 50s. He was a bishop. And he used to have a television program on a nightly or weekly, I should say, on prime time. I think it was on NBC. And he was probably the most famous Catholic evangelist of the 20th century. I think Robert Barron is trying to be the next Fulton Sheen, Bishop Barron. But he has this saying, it's like there's only a few people who hate the Catholic Church for what it represents or what it teaches, but there are millions of people who hate it for what they think it represents or what it teaches. And I think that's very accurate because my encounter with Protestants and with atheists regarding Catholicism is a lot of things they bring up are ideas that they think that the Catholic Church believes in that we don't. And you can read the Catechism. If you're a Protestant, the Catechism is essentially a book that in its best form tries to encapsulate what the Catholic Church teaches about everything, about dogma, about doctrine, about the Trinity, about the sacraments, whatever it is, the existence of God. And so it's a book. You can also find it online for free. And so you'll find Protestants that I encounter that grew up thinking that the Catholic Church worships statues, we practice idolatry, or that we worship Mary as a goddess, or that we made up some stuff, or that Constantine created the church, or that we took books out of the Bible, or that we were part of Romanism and we corrupted the true primitive church. And there's a bunch of stuff. There's a bunch of stuff we could talk about. And I will tell them, it's like, no, brother in Christ, we don't believe this. You can look it up in the Catechism, or you can just go to a Catholic site. And I'm amazed because a lot of Protestants will go to Protestant sites to learn about Catholicism. Now, I understand it because everybody has confirmation bias to a certain extent. But if you're earnestly wanting to learn about the Catholic faith, why would you go to a Baptist site? It's like a Baptist going to a Methodist site to learn about baptisms. It doesn't make sense. Or going to a Methodist site to learn about Catholicism. If you want to learn about the faith, go to a Catholic source. And we have so many. EWTN, of course, is the largest Catholic media outlet, both on television or radio. Or you can go to Catholic Answers, which is a well-known apostolate. That's a podcast. And they have Catholic.com is their website. And they have tons of tracts and articles about every question that a Protestant could possibly have on the Catholic faith. So you have these outlets. And look, I get it, in the 1970s, it was difficult because you didn't have these outlets to learn about the faith, but there's really no excuse not to learn about the faith if you have a true earnestness in learning about the faith, because all these resources are there. You can go to call-in shows at Catholic Answers, or EWTN has open forum or open line every day. And you can call and talk to theologians who will answer questions about the Catholic faith. So I would tell you, any of you guys who believe that the Catholic faith is evil, wrong, or whatever it is, I would ask you to consult Catholic sources, because more often than not, you have a misconception of what the Catholic Church teaches. Like, for example, we don't worship statues. Of course not. That's idolatry. That's a violation of, in our list, the violation of the first commandment. And the Protestants, they'll say it's the second, but we combine the first and second. Because remember, in the Torah, the commandments were not enumerated. There was no verses. Chapters and verses were added by the Catholic Church into the Bible around 900 AD. So it's just enumeration. The listing is different. But of course, we don't worship statues. Like the crucifix behind me, that way. We don't worship that. Sure, you might go to a Catholic church and you see people kneeling at the crucifix. What are they doing? They're not worshiping the wood. They're worshiping Jesus Christ, the Trinity. So there's three types of worship in the Catholic Church. So when Protestants think that we worship Mary, they don't understand. We use the words worship in a different way. We only worship the Trinity. And we have a special term for that. It's called latria. So we only worship the Trinity, Father, Son, Holy Ghost. So when we are praying in front of a crucifix, we're not looking at that piece of wood as some sort of golden calf, so to speak. It's just a visual representation of Jesus Christ and what Jesus Christ did for us on the cross. That's all it is. It's no different that, look, I have a drawing of Istanbul on my back right, or these maps. It's no different than that. Let's say you have a picture of your grandmother, and you're looking at the picture of your grandmother, You're just looking at the picture of your grandmother to remind you of your grandmother. Of course, you can remember your grandmother, let's say, without looking at the picture, but the picture is a visual reminder of your grandmother, so it helps you kind of focus on your grandmother. The crucifix is no different, or a statue that we have of Jesus is no different. It's no different. It just helps us visually focus on our prayer. Now, going back to the different types of prayer, we also have dulia. So dulia is just giving honor to something or somebody. So in the Catholic Church, we give dulia to saints, to people that have lived exemplary lives and that we believe are in heaven. And so dulia would be to Saint Mark, the evangelist, Saint John, Saint Matthew, Saint Paul. And then we have special dulia, or special type of veneration or respect toward Mary. She is the hyperdulia because she was the mother of God. All Protestants, aside from the cults, believe this. She is the Theotokos that was defined in the Council of Ephesus in 431 AD. And the reason why it was in Ephesus is because that's where the house where Mary and St. John lived after Christ was ascended into heaven. So you can actually go visit that house. And so they had the council over there. And it was mostly, it was the bishops of Christendom, what we would call Christendom at the time. So they defined her as Theotokos. So she's the mother of God. So we just respect her as the mother of God. That's all it is. We don't worship her. There was a heresy called the Collyridians back in the, I want to say it's the 4th century. And they actually worshipped Mary as a goddess. And the church promptly denounced them as a heresy. We've never worshipped Mary as a goddess. We only worship the Trinity. Mary is like many of the saints, somebody that we use the verb venerate, which is just give a lot of respect because she was the womb that brought the Word made flesh. She is the new Eve. She's the new Ark of the Covenant. And as that, we respect her. That's all it is. So when we have crucifixes, another thing that Protestants believe is that we have crucifixes and it's a reminder, a constant reminder of how we keep crucifying Christ. No, and look, all of Christendom, up into really the first couple centuries of the Protestant Revolution, had crucifixes. Everybody had a crucifix. Yeah, you'll find early iconography of a cross, like in the catacombs, prior to the legalization of Christianity by Constantine. But once Christianity was legalized by Constantine in the Edict of Milan, we had crucifixes, the corpus, as we say. And that was pretty common. Even if you look at the first generation of Protestants like Luther and Calvin, they had crucifixes as well. But eventually crucifixes were phased out of the Protestant world as denominationalism spread because it smacked of popery. You know, the Catholics have it, then you can't have it. And then they kind of spun this rationalization that we keep crucifying Christ. No, we praise Christ crucified, as St. Paul says in 1 Corinthians. And it's just a visual reminder of the sacrifice that he did for us. And if you go to Latin America, I mean, they'll have bloody crucifixes. And I personally like bloody crucifixes because it's a more of an accurate depiction of what Christ looked like after he was scourged and crowned and beaten and all these things before he was put on the cross. That's one of the reasons I like Gibson's Passion of the Christ, because at the time when the movie came out, some people said it was very graphic, but I mean, that's what happened to Christ. He suffered the most miserable and humiliating of deaths, which is crucifixion. Another thing is like the sign of the cross. So the sign of the cross was largely faced out by Protestants because it smelled of popery. And you can read early church fathers like Tertullian, and Tertullian's like late 100s, early 200s, and he talked about in his writings how even at his time they were doing the sign of the cross. And he even said that, because we have this succession of oral history, of sacred oral tradition. So if you look at St. Ignatius of Antioch, St. Polycarp, these two early Christians and were trained by John the Evangelist, by St. John, by John who wrote the Gospel of John in the book of Apocalypse. They were trained by him. And then they trained St. Irenaeus of Lyon, who's another church father who wrote a very famous apologetic work called Against Heresies. So you look like in the first 50, 75 years, of Christianity. We have these successors, like apostles taught another generation, taught another generation. So go back to Tertullian. He said that in his writings, which you can find, that the apostles were doing the sign of the cross. And that first generation of people on the way, as we call them. So you see that played out in Acts. We're doing the sign of the cross. And what's the sign of the cross? We're just acknowledging what? The Trinity, which all Protestants and Christians believe. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So it's a public acknowledgement, open acknowledgement of the Trinity. And it's an open sign that you are a Christian. That's all the crucifix is. So the large majority of Protestants believe in the Trinity, but they won't ever do the crucifix, the sign of the cross, because it's too Catholic. It's too Catholic. But we've been doing this since the very beginning of the church. And that the other thing is, Cardinal Newman was an Anglican bishop, and then later he converted to Catholicism. He's a well-known writer. He has a lot of works, and he's maybe like late 19th century. And he has a phrase like, those who know history cease to be Protestant. And you see this, like a lot of Protestants who start reading the church fathers, or as we call them, the patristic fathers. They realize that the early church was in fact very Catholic. And you can find all these books on Amazon, like the Didache. The Didache was a book that is typically ascribed by small T tradition to be written by one of the apostles. And this book was written probably around 86 AD, so, second generation of Christians. And you can, again, get this book on Amazon. And it demonstrates that the early church was a proto-Catholic. You can look at the writings of Clement of Rome. He has his writings. He was the third pope. Peter was the first, and then it was Linus, and then Anacletus, then Clement. Yeah, I think so. He was the fourth pope. And we have his writings, most famously his writing to the church in Corinth. You can read his writings. You can look at Ignatius of Antioch. He was, again, taught by St. John, and he was condemned by the Romans, and on the way to Rome, he wrote letters. He has 7 letters, I believe. And you can read those, very Catholic. Justin Martyr, another early writer, like 100, 110 AD. Read his writings. So when you read these guys' writings, you see that they believed in the real presence of the Eucharist, that was truly the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ. That the early church, they're witnesses to that the early church believed that. You can look at even 1 Corinthians by Paul. 1 Corinthians 11 talks about those who receive the Eucharist who are not in a state of grace, as we would say, will get sick or even die. So you see him writing 1 Corinthians probably around 60 AD, which is only one generation from Christ's death. And the early church did have a they wouldn't call it Mass at that point, because Mass is a Latin term, which means to send out. But they were gathering for the breaking of the bread. That's what they called it. Think of the Supper of Emmaus. They were gathering to read Scripture, and then later for the breaking of the bread. And they truly believed that was the body and blood of Christ. And you see this written in John 6, right? John's gospel is written late, much later than the Synoptics, probably around 90 to 100 AD. So he's writing that after seeing that the apostles, after reading the Synoptics, Matthew, Mark, Luke. And so you notice, like, John doesn't have the Last Supper narrative. So he's supplementing the Last Supper narrative by having the John 6 Bread of Life discourse. And in the Bread of Life discourse, which is one of the longest chapters in the Gospels, I mean, how many times does Christ repeat it? You must eat my body and drink my blood for everlasting life. And he keeps repeating it. And he, John even says it, that people walked away because they couldn't believe it, because they kept asking Jesus, how can we eat your body and drink your blood? And he doesn't say, you know what, I'm being metaphorical. He just says, go believe. That Christ never pleads or begs people to believe him. He's like, look, this is the teaching. If you don't want to believe it, see ya. Those who hear you, hear me. That's what he tells the apostles. Right? That's the kind of the deposit of faith that he gives Peter and the apostles in Matthew 16 and Matthew 18. What you bind is bound. What you unbind is unbound. When he gives the keys to Peter. And so the early church truly believed that was the body and blood of Jesus Christ. St. Paul talks about it one generation later, and then you have these patristic fathers, or the church fathers, all writing in their writings that we truly believe in the body and blood of Christ. And everybody believes in the body and blood of Christ. Like if you look at the Apostles' Creed, It's not even mentioned in the Apostles' Creed. The Apostles' Creed is just to clear up some Christology, because in the early church it was all like, is Jesus true God, true man? What's the nature? Does the Holy Spirit emanate from the Son or from the God, from Father and Son? What's going on? So if you look at Counts of Ephesus, Counts of Nicaea, Constantinople I, Constantinople II, Chalcedon, they were all like trying to clear up Christology. None of it brought up the real presence, because nobody didn't believe in the real presence. Everybody believed that was truly the body and blood, soul and divinity of Jesus Christ. Everybody believed that until the Protestant revolutions, the Protestant heretics of the 16th century. Everybody believed that. And even Luther believed in the real presence. And if you look at the first couple of generations of the Lutherans, they believed in the real presence. And then on the other side of kind of the arch heretics of that first generation, you had someone like Zwingli, who did not believe in the real presence. And then Calvin kind of came a generation later, said, well, it's kind of a real presence, but not really. But Luther believed, and there's a lot of things Lutherans don't believe. Luther believed in the perpetual virginity of Mary. Luther believed in the real presence. He believed in very Catholic things. He was Catholic. He was Catholic until he rebelled. So the early church, you can read in the patristic fathers the belief in the real presence. You can read in their writings also the belief in the intercession of saints, of people who have passed away. And that's really rooted in the Old Testament, asking someone to pray for you. Like we ask for people to pray for me all the time. I ask my mom, pray for me. It's no different than people who've died. You can look at Revelation 5:8 and Revelation 8:3. The people in heaven are hearing our prayers. You look at 2 Maccabees, the prophet Jeremiah is hearing the prayers of the Maccabeans. It's like, I hear your prayers. So the early church believed in intercessory prayer. You look at Irenaeus, again, who was a second generation from the apostles. He writes against heresies in one of his writings that the church believed, like, wherever the bishop is, so is the church. You look at Ignatius of Antioch. He's the one who came up with the term of the Catholic Church. Wherever the church is the Catholic Church. Catholic just means universal. In other words, like anyone could belong to the Catholic Church, because that was the only Christian church at the time. So the word is just like, you can be free or a slave, Gentile, Jew, anyone could be a Catholic. And that's where the term Catholic means. It's just a Greek word for universal. And so Ignatius of Antioch was the first one to use that term around 110 AD. So again, early church. All right, we got somebody here. Cool. If you want to call in, let me know. Do we have more writings from the apostles beyond the Bible? I mentioned the Didache. You can find that book on Amazon. The Didache is attributed, and we have a video here on 5-Minute Catholic Apologetics on the Didache. The Didache is attributed to be written by the apostles, though it has not been authenticated as being written by the apostles. We do know it was written by somebody that was part of the way or Christianity in the late first century. So you're only thinking about 50 years since the death of Christ. And you can read that book. And it's certainly, again, it's a good book to realize that the church was very Catholic in its beliefs. In terms of that, you also have like the Gospel of Thomas. But the Gospel of Thomas is a Gnostic gospel that was written 300 years later that they just slapped on the name of Thomas. It is always considered to be heretical. And it's Gnostic because the Gnostics believed like there was a secret faith, kind of a very Da Vinci Code, right? The Da Vinci Code really kind of embraced the Gnostics, but it's kind of like there's a secret knowledge that's passed on and so forth, which is very contrary to the teachings of Jesus Christ, was not to keep anything secret at all. So you'll have some books that have the apostles' names on them, but they're what we would say are spurious or apocryphal because they are not in line with what the deposit of faith is that we've had since the apostles and in oral tradition and sacred oral tradition and in the writing of the New Testament works. So any of these works that came out 300 years later that were contrary to what we knew, what was doctrinal Christian teaching, are considered spurious. Nobody reads them. And you can find the Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Mary Magdalene, Gospel of Judas. You can buy these on Amazon and just read them for fun. But they're just really bad. Like I can't remember which one. I think it's the Gospel of Thomas where Jesus kills some kid for stealing his toy, and then Joseph has to convince him to bring the kid back to life. It's like Jesus wouldn't do that. Another good book would be the Proto-Evangelium of James. That is a book you can get on Amazon as well. That is written around the same time, first century. And it really gives a good backstory to Jesus' birth. In particular, it focuses a lot on Mary and Saint Joseph and on Mary's parents and how Mary was always expected to be a virgin, and that she, in fact, spent her childhood, because Saint Joachim and Saint Anna, her parents, struggled to have a child. They couldn't conceive. And eventually they conceived Mary late in their old age, kind of like Sarah and Abraham and Elizabeth and Zechariah. And that book kind of talks about her birth and then how she was sent to the temple in Jerusalem, and there she was raised. And eventually she had to leave the temple because when she had her first menstruation, you couldn't have any, like in Leviticus, you couldn't have any blood, unclean blood, as they called it back then. And so then at that point, she was married to Joseph. And that was a Josephite marriage. Of course, they never had sex. They never consecrated because she was the Ark of the Covenant. You think of the Ark of the Covenant in 1 Samuel, if someone touched the Ark of the Covenant, they died immediately. So it was always believed, again, the perpetual virginity was never questioned until the Protestant revolutions of the 16th century. Never questioned. Everybody always believed in the perpetual virginity of Mary, even Martin Luther. What other books I would recommend you could find, though they're not apostles, you can write St. Ignatius of Antioch's letters that are, again, he's a disciple of St. John. You can read his letters. Again, you can find these free online, and you can read his letters. And again, very Catholic. Justin Martyr as well. St. Augustine would be later on. St. Irenaeus. These are doctors of the church. You can read their writings too. St. Augustine, of course, is St. Augustine, as we're supposed to pronounce it, is one of the doctors of the church. He's one of the greatest theologians of all time, him and Aquinas. And he's got a great story about his conversion. Was there a practical point in St. John not being martyred? Yeah. I mean, look, you could look at it one way. The church doesn't really have a teaching on this. Again, you can read the catechism on this. But John was the only apostle who didn't abandon Christ. So I don't think, again, I'm not a theologian. I'm certainly not speaking for the church. But it just seems coincidental or anecdotal that the one apostle that doesn't abandon him is the one who's not martyred. Now, I do have an episode here on how each of the 12 apostles, and when I mean 12, I mean Matthias, because Matthias replaced Judas, how they were all martyred, the different ways they were martyred, where they were martyred. And I talk about in there how John was captured and the Roman emperor tried to kill John. Maybe it wasn't the emperor, it was like a local Roman consul, tried to kill him, but he was unable to be killed. I forgot exactly how they tried to kill him. And then at that point, they exiled him to Patmos, the island in the Aegean Sea, where he's reputed to have written his books of the New Testament over there. And then, of course, he took care of the Blessed Mother, because we see at the foot of the cross how Jesus tells him to take care of Mary. And so he lives with Mary for a few years until Mary is assumed into heaven by the power of God. But yeah, that's about St. John. I love, I did a video recently about the epistles, and I love 1 John. I think James and 1 John are just my favorite. I love John because John is so beautifully written. The Gospel of John too, but I'm talking about 1 John. Just God is love. It's just the way it's written. I just find it so uplifting and it's so beautiful. And the epistles, some of them I don't find to be as approachable. Like I talk to my friends, like I don't like Hebrews. I find Hebrews not really approachable. Not to say like it's all divinely inspired. And of course, it all has its purposes. So when I'm saying like I don't like a certain book more than another, it's not that I'm aligning that book. It's just all about approachability. Like look at the Gospels. The Gospels are exceedingly approachable, right? They're so relatable, especially the parables. But you read something like Hebrews. Hebrews is all about the Melchizedek priesthood versus the kind of the Levitical priesthood versus the priesthood of Jesus. And a lot of it just really isn't applicable. But I love James and I like the pastoral letters because I just find them to be very applicable. So I like 1 Timothy and James and 1 John, 1 Peter. I really like those epistles. And they're short too, and they're easy to read. Maud, are you Catholic? I'm assuming you are because you use the word saint. Or either you're Anglican or maybe you're Orthodox. What's your interaction? Is your family Catholic? What kind of church do you go to? Why don't you give me a little background on yourself? these last 10 minutes. So I really recommend that Catholics and Protestants read the patristic fathers, the church fathers. And really the church father period kind of runs, depending on who, which theologian you talk to. Maybe Boethius is the last church father, he's like 7th century, but certainly the first 300 years. A lot of people, Catholics included, but certainly Protestants, is like they think there's the Bible and then there's like nothing really until Luther or Calvin or whoever their progenitor of their denomination is. And then maybe some like their pastor's current writings, whoever it is, or some national pastor like Joel Osteen or somebody like that. And a lot of them just simply don't know that we have these writings of the apostles that you can access, and they're very accessible and very readable. Not all of them, some of them, like Eusebius's Church History, that's written late 200s. That's a good book to have in your library because Eusebius, again, from oral tradition, from receiving what he from the apostles, successors of the apostles, disciples, he's writing a lot about the early church. And like a lot of it is kind of dry, like who's the first bishop of Antioch, who's the second bishop of Alexandria, who's it there? But he also talks about like how the different apostles were martyred. He talks about different heresies. It's a very useful book to have. It is a little dry. St. Augustine, of course, is probably the most prolific writer of the patristic fathers, and everybody's got to read Confessions. I mean, Confessions is just sublime writing. I mean, anybody, a Christian, Protestant, everyone should read Confessions. It's essentially his conversion story he was a Manichaeist, I think. And so he was his father was pagan, his mother was Saint Monica, and he was a very bright student, just very bright, but like too bright. And so he started believing kind of these heretical teachings from a heretical school. And then he was a teacher, and he talks about being a teacher. And then eventually he went up to Milan and was exposed to St. Ambrose, who's another doctor of the church. And St. Ambrose, he was just blown away by St. Ambrose's sermons and teaching style. And that's one of the reasons he became Catholic. And then there's a story, I have an episode here about how he heard a voice. And then there was a verse that a voice told him to read, and it was Romans something, I forgot what it was. And through a combination of events, and no doubt the intercession of his mother, St. Monica, who was always praying for him to leave his dissolute life, that eventually St. Augustine became a Catholic and became one of the greatest theologians of all time. And talk about, and he writes so honestly in Confessions about his life of fornication and dissolute living. He had a live-in lover for many years in college. He was banging a lot of women, and then eventually he had a concubine. He was living in concubinage, so to speak, and I had a child. I can't remember what his name is. And he admits in Confessions, because he's writing Confessions like in retrospect. He's writing it. He's probably middle-aged. I can't remember when exactly he wrote it in his life. But he's looking back at his life and how he eventually came to Jesus Christ. And he's just very open about his sin. And it's just a beautiful writing. It's just a very beautiful writing. And so if any Catholic or Protestants haven't read Confessions, it is just probably, I would say, is the go-to reading if you have to read some extra biblical writing of the first 400 years of Christianity. I would definitely read Confessions because it's so relatable. You can read it today and you can really relate to it. Protestant Catholic, graduate Providence College, a Dominican school in Rhode Island. Nice. It's great. It's great, brother. It's great. All right, guys, that's really all I have. I mean, this is mostly for anybody who wants to watch this later on. Again, any Protestants who are listening to this, I would tell you just go to Catholic Answers, go to Catholic sites, and just any belief that you have, look it up on Catholic sources. The beliefs on the Pope, and there's a lot of misconceptions about the Pope, and there's a lot of misconceptions about a lot of things. And Catholicism, there's 1.2 billion Catholics. It is growing very quickly in Asia and Africa, not so much in the West, because I mean, there's no Christian group that is growing in the West because, as St. Pius X predicted, modernism and really postmodernistic thinking and secularism has so crept into Europe, where Europe is truly mission territory again for all Christians, not just Catholics. And it's sad because that was the cauldron, that was the bastion of Christendom, of Christianity, and now the large majority of, there's some bastions out there still, like pockets of Hungary, pockets of Poland, pockets of Slovakia, but the large majority of Europe is not practicing anything. And you see that to a certain extent here in the United States. So we have to pray for the Europeans. And lastly, if any of you are Catholics, like Maud, like you're here, just do your little thing, whatever you can to evangelize. I mean, I don't have any theology degrees. I'm just a guy who loves the faith and likes to talk about it. So if all Catholics would just have some outlet, create an apostolate, create a Legion of Mary in your parish, whatever it is, just if we would all just go out there, I think we can really make a difference. But in the meanwhile, keep praying, always pray for the church, always pray to follow God's will, not our own will, and just be the best Christians that we can be and do great works and love our Christ and so forth. All right, guys, until next time, take care. God bless.